Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. So, this is part 2 of 5 concerning Obama and Russia. So, if you want to check out part 1, please check the description. That covered a number of stuff that I'm going to assume you have some familiarity with as we delve into part 2. So, last time we covered some of the major events preceding the Obama presidency. Detailing the evolution of Western and in particular U.S. attitudes towards the future of NATO, and following the uncertainty of the HW presidency, seeing how the Clinton administration opted for the expansion of NATO, couching this policy in the language of triumphal liberalism. We then touched briefly on NATO's involvement in Yugoslavia and then its initial phases of expansion. We next turned our attention eastward to look at how the leadership of the Russian Federation viewed developments in the West, how they grappled with the collapse and subsequent recovery of their economy, and how that economic recovery interacted with the notions of Russian exceptionalism that came to dominate the intelligentsia of Putin's government. Finally, we covered Russia's attempts at regaining its standing as a great power, a peer of the United States. We saw the second Bush ignore these overtures in the early 2000s in favor of a unipolar liberal hegemony. And we witnessed the first steps of Russia's elites to reasserting their country as a counterweight to the United States, most notably when Russia reacted to the possibility of Georgia joining NATO by invading that country in 2008. We will now turn our attention to Obama and keep it there for the next 4 videos. This video, part 2, will focus on his first presidential term, where he and his administration worked hard to develop a more cooperative relationship with Russia. And the conservatives would lampoon this reset as a pipe dream, as playing into Putin's wily and expert hands. But throughout his tenure, Obama insisted that he was simply trying to find those specific points of common interest and achieve pragmatic solutions instead of falling back on stale skepticism and mutual recrimination. So let's see how his first 4 years go and the kinds of successes he achieves, the kind of roadblocks he runs into, and just what exactly happened up until 2012.
Now, Mr. Spock.
Section 1. The reset begins. Obama understood that relations had soured throughout the Bush II years. Not only had Putin grown more bellicose during the early 2000s, but U.S. policy under Bush had become, in Obama's estimation, both dangerously unilateral and tethered too tightly to the Middle East, leaving other regions to suffer by neglect. To rectify this state of affairs, Obama recalled, "My administration's hope was to initiate what we were calling a reset with Russia, opening a dialogue in order to protect our interests, support our democratic partners in the region, and enlist cooperation on our goals for nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament."
It's a profit deal.
Of course, cooperation with Russia did not mean abandoning existing commitments. Obama understood that NATO allies needed reassurances from the new administration, for many European leaders no longer trusted U.S. leadership after the fiasco of the previous 8 years. In March 2009, for instance, Obama tried both to articulate his vision for the Russia reset and at the same time reiterate his continued support for NATO.
We've had a good exchange between ourselves and the Russians. I've said that we need to reset or reboot the relationship there. Russia needs to understand our unflagging commitment to the independence and security of countries like a Poland or a Czech Republic. On the other hand, we have areas of common concern.
Russia's leaders foresaw limited opportunities for the reset as well, primarily the prospect of recognition as a global power and a more equal relationship with the United States. Economics also entered into the calculus, as the Russians hoped that bolstering Western ties would allow their country to obtain Western technology, foster foreign investment, allow them to repair their infrastructure, and reduce their economic dependence on energy exports. In April 2009, Obama met with Russian President Medvedev, himself recently elected. They talked about a range of issues. Although they disagreed over the recent invasion of Georgia, Obama recognized that, at base, there was little to be gained by harping on the subject. Instead, he focused on future possibilities. The two leaders agreed on the need for cooperation on Obama's highest priority, nuclear non-proliferation. Medvedev agreed to begin immediate negotiations to hammer out a follow-up to the soon-to-expire Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START. Medvedev also seemed open to the idea of working with the U.S. to contain Iranian nuclear ambitions, admitting that Iran's nuclear and missile programs had advanced much faster than Moscow had expected. The two men also discussed the possibility of Russia assisting U.S. efforts in Afghanistan, where the U.S. mission was currently hampered by a reliance on Pakistani supply routes. Since one of Obama's earliest foreign policy goals was a victory in this good war, Russian cooperation there was certainly welcomed. The meeting left the Obama team optimistic. Recalled Obama, quote, Medvedev showed a readiness to engage with frankness and flexibility. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton recalled that the reset seemed to be on track. Section 2. Bilateral Cooperation. Afghanistan. In July 2009, Russia and the U.S. signed an agreement to allow the transport of lethal military equipment through Russia to Afghanistan. The U.S. needed a supply route for its troops that circumvented the monopoly then enjoyed by Pakistan. The Russians acceded because they hoped it would allow them to expand their own military footprint across Central Asia. Facilitating U.S. efforts in Afghanistan in order to bolster Russian influence in Central Asia was certainly a calculated risk on the part of the Russians, but one that, in Clinton's estimation at any rate, fitted the great game mentality that characterized Russian foreign policy. An outlook that stood in stark contrast to U.S. liberals who preferred an international system of trade and relation institutionalized under U.S. hegemony. NATO. Obama had inherited a nervous and disgruntled batch of European allies. Their support for Bush's invasion of Afghanistan in late 2001 had been practically universal, but sharp divisions emerged between the U.S. and many of its major continental allies after the U.S. invaded Iraq in early 2003. In the years that followed, many Western European leaders, who had to grapple with terror attacks of their own, grew ever more frustrated with the global war on terror that seemed more prone to spreading than containing violence. While major Western European allies fretted at the vicissitudes of war in the Middle East, countries closer to Russia had observed Bush's acquiescence to Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 and had grown increasingly skeptical of U.S. leadership. Obama had sought to ameliorate European allies early in his term and used the 2010 NATO summit in Lisbon to continue these efforts. Addressing Western European critiques of U.S. foreign policy as warlike and adventuresome, Obama stressed that the U.S. and NATO were committed to drawing down the fight in Iraq and stabilizing the situation in Afghanistan. Obama did say that the fight against terror would continue, as that was necessary for the safety of people in both the U.S. and the EU. Nevertheless, his constant focus on the already existing fights, especially Afghanistan, were meant to allay concerns that the war on terror would fester and grow. Obama's was to be a policy of containment. In order to mollify the concerns of the Eastern European NATO members, Obama reaffirmed his nation's commitment to NATO, lauding its past accomplishments and declaring it essential to the future of European security.
For more than 60 years, NATO has proven itself as the most successful alliance in history. It's defended the independence and freedom of its members. It has nurtured young democracies and welcomed them into Europe that is whole and free. It has acted to end ethnic cleansing beyond our borders. and today we stand united in Afghanistan so that terrorists who threaten us all have no safe haven and so that the Afghan people can forge a more hopeful future. At no time during these past 6 decades was our success guaranteed. Indeed, there have been many times when skeptics have predicted the end of this alliance. But each time, NATO has risen to the occasion and adapted to meet the challenges of that time. And now, as we face a new century with very different challenges from the last, we have come together here in Lisbon to take action in 4 areas that are critical to the future of the alliance. First, we aligned our approach on the way forward in Afghanistan. As we look ahead to a new phase in Afghanistan, we also reached agreement in a second area, a new strategic concept for NATO that recognizes the capabilities and partners that the alliance needs to meet the challenges of the 21st century. We have reaffirmed the central premise of NATO, our Article 5 commitment that an attack on one is an attack on all. And to ensure this commitment has meaning, we agreed to take action in a third area, to modernize our conventional forces and develop the full range of military capabilities that we need to defend our nations. Finally, we agreed to keep forging the partnership beyond NATO that help make our alliance a pillar of global security. After a 2-year break, we are also resuming cooperation between NATO and Russia. I was very pleased that my friend and partner, President Dmitry Medvedev, joined us today at the NATO-Russia Council Summit. Together, we've worked hard to reset the relations between the United States and Russia.
Notably absent from these reforms was the expansion of NATO's borders. Indeed, Obama was silent on the future enlargement of the alliance. Gone were his predecessor's material support and vociferous backing for Georgian and Ukrainian entrance into the defense compact. The Russians, whose very presence at the Lisbon summit already evinced an increased openness to cooperation with NATO, took this silence as further evidence that cooperation might bear fruit. New Start. The Obama administration's early emphasis on the importance and ominence of Russia's nuclear arsenal had played into one key aspect of Russia's identity as a great power. Its nuclear capabilities remained broadly on par with the United States, meaning that without question, in this arena, Russia had legitimate claim to special consideration. Russian leaders were therefore eager to be seen as engaging in negotiations with the U.S. on equal footing, and so, after a year of negotiations, Obama and Medvedev signed the New START Treaty in April 2010. It faced resistance in Congress, but ultimately passed there as well. The treaty limited its purview only to deployed strategic nuclear arms, so it didn't touch stockpiled warheads that weren't currently housed in missiles or bombs, and it also didn't deal with tactical nuclear weapons meant to be used on a particular battlefield. Nevertheless, the treaty did improve upon the nuclear treaty signed by Bush II by including enforcement and accountability mechanisms to ensure compliance. Its terms limited the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads to 1,550 for each country, and set the number of strategic missile launchers and bombers to 800. Provisions specified satellite and remote monitoring of each signatory, with monitoring tags on missiles and bombers for the first time, so everything could be kept track of. Within these limits, the treaty bore legitimate fruit. In 2009, before New START, the U.S. had a combined nuclear arsenal of 2,152 warheads deployed across ICBMs, SLBMs, and heavy bombers. Russia possessed 2,787 warheads distributed across a similar array of launch vehicles. By 2021, those numbers had been reduced to 1,357 for the U.S. and 1,456 for Russia. The treaty thus reduced the combined count of deployed strategic warheads from 4,939 down to 2,813, a decrease of 56.9%. Early missile defense policy. Obama had campaigned against Bush's missile defense posture, couching a reduction in missile defense spending within a broader reduction in the warlike posture of the Bush years. Consider, for instance, this campaign ad from 2008.
I'm the only major candidate who opposed this war from the beginning, and as president, I will end it. Second, I will cut tens of billions of dollars in wasteful spending. I will cut investments in unproven missile defense systems. I will not weaponize space. I will slow our development of future combat systems. And I will institute an independent Defense Priorities Board to ensure that the quadrennial defense review is not used to justify unnecessary spending. Third, I will set a goal of a world without nuclear weapons. To seek that goal, I will not develop new nuclear weapons. I will seek a global ban on the production of fissile material, and I will negotiate with Russia to take our ICBMs off hair trigger alert and to achieve deep cuts in our nuclear arsenals.
Although, as we'll see later on, his administration did ultimately reverse many of these promises. Early in his administration, this campaign rhetoric did translate into policy. The first step in this direction occurred in April 2009, with a $1.4 billion reduction of the Missile Defense Agency's budget. In September, the administration went further by indicating that it no longer intended to move forward with plans proposed by Bush II to deploy a radar installation in the Czech Republic and 10 ground-based interceptors in Poland. Nevertheless, missile defense was not done away with entirely. Obama may have considered Bush II careless and bellicose, but he did not reverse his predecessor's stance on missile defense as a useful deterrent. He simply amended it. So in place of the Bush plan, Obama outlined his own vision of a missile defense shield in Europe, the European Phased Adaptive Approach, or EPAA. He talked about these developments in his 2010 speech to the NATO conference at Lisbon.
Most important, we agreed to develop a missile defense capability for NATO territory, which is necessary to defend against the growing threat from ballistic missiles. The new approach to European missile defense that I announced last year, the Phased Adaptive Approach, will be the United States' contribution to this effort and a foundation for greater collaboration. After years of talk about how to meet this objective, we now have a clear plan to protect all of our allies in Europe, as well as the United States.
This missile defense initiative would be deployed in 4 phases. Phase 1, the permanent deployment of ships equipped with Aegis ballistic missile defenses to Rota, Spain, and a TPY-2 radar deployed to Turkey. Phase 2, deployment of Aegis ashore missile defenses to Poland. Phase 3, deployment of Aegis ashore missile defenses to Romania. A planned 4th phase, designed to protect against limited ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile threats, was ultimately cancelled, perhaps to appease Russian objections to the system. This move was bolstered by Obama's assurances that this missile defense system initiative was not a countermeasure to perceived Russian aggression, but rather a deterrent against a possible Iranian threat. As Obama put it in March 2009,
which is that the missile defense that we have talked about deploying is directed towards not Russia, but Iran. That has always been the concern, that you had potentially a missile from Iran that threatened either the United States or Europe.
In addition to these assurances, Obama also spoke of possible cooperation between Russia and the West on a joint missile defense initiative, a possibility that probably interested the Russians more than Obama knew. In an effort to negotiate as a peer partner, Moscow proposed a joint anti-missile system. Mirroring its status on the UN Security Council, Russia would have veto power over the use of this system, but this suggestion was a limitation that NATO could not countenance. By the end of November 2011, with veto power unattainable, and Russian negotiators unable to obtain written guarantees that the system would not be used against Russia, something the U.S. Senate would not countenance whatever Obama's feelings on the matter, Medvedev announced that negotiations on cooperative missile defense were over. In light of these failed negotiations, Obama decided to proceed with his existing plan for deploying missile interceptors in Romania and Poland by 2018. No longer feeling themselves part of this process, Russian leadership now reacted angrily, assuming that the U.S. sought to undermine mutually assured destruction and the very notion of strategic parity, twin pillars of Russian geopolitical identity and a centerpiece to Russia's security doctrine. Tensions mounted. Iran. As mentioned, in 2009, Russia facilitated the U.S. war in Afghanistan by allowing supplies to route their way through Central Asia. Russian cooperation also assisted the U.S. in dealing with another enemy in the greater Middle East, Iran. In 2010, Russia agreed with the other UN Security Council members to impose severe sanctions on Iran. The sanctions, which included Russian refusal to deliver already paid-for surface-to-air missiles, proved a weighty imposition, one that prompted the Iranians to negotiate a settlement with regard to their nuclear capabilities. This process would culminate in the 2015 Iranian nuclear deal, a diplomatic achievement that Obama himself has heralded as one of the brightest spots of his foreign policy record. Russia pursued these diplomatic efforts for 3 reasons. 1. Trepidation at the prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran. 2. The status and prestige to be gained by working in concert with peer nations to resolve an international dispute. The fact that Russia, in acting as a peer partner with the US and other major powers, put prestige over economic gain, integrating Iran into the world economy meant Iranian oil could flow more freely, which could threaten Russia's oil exports, signaled the lengths to which Russian leadership would go in the pursuit of status, being seen as someone willing to work with the other great powers in dealing with an issue of civilizational import. 3. The possibility that defusing the missile threat posed by Iran might slow or stop the development of missile defense, particularly in Eastern Europe. The Russian leaders might have recalled Obama's March 2009 statement.
To the extent that we are lessening Iran's commitment to nuclear weapons, then that reduces the pressure for, or the need for, a missile defense.
And although the deal would be partially undone by Obama's successor, the fact that the U.S. was able to work so fruitfully with Russia in this endeavor is a notable diplomatic achievement. Libya. I go into a lot more detail regarding Libya in my book, specifically the chapter on the War on Terror, because Obama's policy in Libya was ultimately part of his expansion of the War on Terror across the African continent. So in addition to toppling Gaddafi, he sponsored training and the use of military proxies in various countries. He authorized drone strikes against terrorist targets, quote unquote, that kind of thing. So there's a lot more detail on that stuff in my book. Here specifically, I only wanted to touch on it briefly as it relates to Russia. In 2011, when the U.S. pushed for international intervention into Libya, Russia declined to use its veto power in the UN Security Council, a move which prompted China to demur as well. This allowed UN backing for the no-fly zone in Libya, which grounded Gaddafi's air force and helped topple his government. Like Iran, the fact that Russia did not spoil Western designs provided both a short-term victory for the United States, but some international prestige for the Russian Federation as well. Trade. In December 2012, Congress overwhelmingly passed legislation allowing Obama to grant permanent normal trade relations to Russia. This was done in order to ensure that U.S. companies got the most out of Russia's recent entry into the World Trade Organization. This step removed the last vestiges of Soviet-era limitations on U.S. trade with Russia. Nevertheless, a caveat remained: the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act. Obama himself resisted this bill, but signed it when he realized that its passage was the only way the old trade restrictions could be lifted. The rationale that a bipartisan Congress provided for this law is worth pausing to consider. The text begins with Congress declaring that the U.S., quote, aspires to a mutually beneficial relationship with the Russian Federation based on respect for human rights and the rule of law, and supports the people of the Russian Federation in their efforts to realize their full economic potential and to advance democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. The bill then lists the international institutions that Russia is a party to that hold it to a higher human rights standard, including its membership in international bodies, ratification of treaties like that against torture or the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and its signing of the European Convention on Human Rights. At this point, the bill's authors make a critical assertion, quote, human rights are an integral part of international law and lie at the foundation of the international order. The protection of human rights, therefore, particularly in the case of a country that has incurred obligations to protect human rights under an international agreement to which it is a party, is not left exclusively to the internal affairs of that country. With the international status of Russia thus outlined, and a justification for possible U.S. intervention established, the bill then turns its attention to the titular example of Sergei Magnitsky, whose investigations into corruption led to his arrest and ultimate death at the hands of Russian authorities. With the martyr's credentials thoroughly established, the bill then moves on and begins to explicate remedies to these human rights abuses that the United States can implement. It is the sense of Congress that the United States should continue to strongly support and provide assistance to the efforts of the Russian people to establish a vibrant democratic political system that respects individual liberties and human rights, including by enhancing the provision of objective information through all relevant media, such as radio liberty and the Internet, the Russian government's suppression of dissent and political opposition, the limitations it has imposed on civil society and independent media, and the deterioration of economic and political freedom inside Russia are of profound concern to the United States government and to the American people. This concern would translate into more than merely providing information. With this Wilsonian line of argument as its foundation, the bill then provides the executive with the legal basis for disciplining human rights abusers via the tool of economic sanction. Russian elites balked at this law, which Putin said, quote, poisons our relationship. Russian leadership in general considered the law as infringing upon the domestic affairs of what was supposed to be a sovereign nation. Putin's response to this slight was multifaceted and colored by earlier Obama administration support for anti-Putin protesters, who had decried his 2012 re-election as a fraud. Putin took this as another interference in a domestic concern, another slight against Russian sovereignty. Among other things, the Russian government subsequently prohibited the U.S. adoption of Russian orphans, pressured most NGOs to leave the country, asked the U.S. Agency for International Development to shut down its operations within the country, and refused to renew the Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, a primary avenue of U.S.-Russian cooperation going back decades. The way in which the U.S. government re-established normal trade relations with the Russian Federation encapsulates the essentially limited nature of Obama's Russia reset. Both countries obviously stood to make real, material gains from an increase in trade, but the strings that Congress foisted upon this deepening of commercial ties came off to Russia's leaders as judgmental, hypocritical, even hostile. Certainly not the kind of treatment one peer nation would inflict upon another. Given the long history of U.S. intervention in the internal affairs of nations around the globe, up to and including U.S. leadership in the NATO interventions in Serbia during the 1990s, Is it any wonder that Russians looked upon the language of the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act with scorn? Keep this in mind in the videos ahead, as we chronicle the limited diplomatic cooperation that took place in Syria and the diametric opposition that characterized Ukraine. Also keep this precedent in mind when we come back to Russia's role in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Thus ends our chronicle of the early spheres of bilateral cooperation between the world's primary nuclear powers. Within the pragmatic limitations Obama outlined early in his administration, and of course judging things from the perspective of U.S. empire, there were some major accomplishments, especially with regard to fighting, toppling, or otherwise trammeling longtime antagonists of the United States. Moreover, the drastic reduction of deployed strategic weapons achieved by New START was both a victory for all humankind and the fulfillment of a campaign promise. Nevertheless, as Obama's first term came to a close, the avenues of cooperation narrowed. Disagreements over missile defense in Europe and the prospect of continued U.S. interference in Russia's domestic politics rankled many within that gargantuan federation, especially as it became increasingly clear that mutual cooperation with the United States was not yielding that primary goal of Russian foreign policy, a recognition by the United States and the West that Russia was a great power on par with its peers. This feeling sharpened when Putin reassumed the presidency in 2012, prompting more focus on points of difference and shaping the Russian reaction to the catastrophe in Syria. That's going to be the topic of the next video in this series, Part 3. If you like this content, consider subscribing or following me on Twitter. And if you're interested in other aspects of the Obama presidency, you can check out some of my other videos or my book, He Was Our Man in Washington, A History of the Obama Years, out from Zero Books. See you next time.